The iron head of the spade sliced into the black soil with a sound like a deep breath. Elias shifted his weight, his worn leather boots finding purchase on the tool's shoulder, and drove it down another 6 inches. He levered the handle back, the muscles in his arms and shoulders coiling tight, and lifted a square of earth, heavy with moisture and smelling of deep thyme. He tossed it onto the growing mound beside the excavation. Boro, a great gray dog with the calm eyes of a wolf and the patient soul of a saint, watched from the shade of a lone cottonwood. He lifted his head, sniffed the air, and let out a soft huff before settling his chin back on his paws. It was the 10th day of this work. The hole was now 4 feet deep and perhaps 12 feet square. From the path that skirted his father's fallow field, a voice cut through the rhythmic scrape and thud of the shovel. "Still at it, boy?" Elias paused, leaning on the spade's handle. He didn't look up immediately, instead wiping a bead of sweat from his brow with the back of a dirty forearm. Silas Blackwood stood there, his hands on his hips, his face a roadmap of weathered skepticism. He was a man who had seen 60 winters in this valley and believed he understood all their rules. "I am," Elias said. His own voice was quiet, unused. He hadn't spoken to anyone but Boro in over a week. Silas shook his head, a gesture of pity more than scorn. "It's a fine root cellar you're digging, but it's July. You've got wood to cut. A winter's worth. I haven't seen you touch an axe." "I have a plan," Elias said, turning his attention back to the earth. He drove the spade in again. "A plan?" Silas chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "Your father, God rest his soul, was a good man, but he filled your head with strange notions from those books of his. You can't live in a hole in the ground, Elias, not without a fire." "I don't see a place for a chimney." "There isn't one," Elias said, his words slightly muffled as he bent to his task. This stopped Silas cold. He squinted, as if trying to see the logic that was so clearly absent. "No chimney? What are you going to do, boy? Burn coal in a bucket and suffocate in your sleep? That's the craziest thing I've ever heard. You'll be a block of ice before the first good snow." Elias stopped again and finally looked at the older man. His eyes were the color of a winter sky, clear and unblinking. "It'll work." He offered no further explanation. He didn't mention his father's journals, the pages filled with meticulous drawings and calculations. He didn't talk about the strata of soil, the thermal properties of the river stone he planned to line the walls with, or the concept of geothermal mass. His father had written it all down in the last year of his life, a final obsession. "The earth remembers the summer," one entry read. "It holds the heat like a sleeping animal, and you only need to know how to ask for it." Elias was asking. Silas watched him for another long minute, the boy's steady, relentless digging a silent refutation of all common sense. He finally shook his head again, turned, and walked away, his boots scuffing up dust from the path. "Wait until winter," he muttered to himself, loud enough for Elias to hear. "Winter will teach him." Elias watched him go. He felt no anger, no need to defend himself. The proof was not in words. The proof was here, in the deepening hole, in the ache in his back, in the plan laid out in his father's elegant script. Boro whined softly, and Elias reached a hand out of the pit to scratch behind the dog's ears. "He doesn't see it, Boro," he murmured. "But we do." The dog leaned into his touch, a warm, living weight of trust. Then Elias picked up the spade and went back to work, the sun beating down on his neck, the heat of the day sinking deep into the ground. He was storing the summer, one shovelful at a time. Weeks bled into one another under the relentless August sun. The hole deepened, reaching a final depth of 8 feet. The pile of excavated earth became a small mountain. Now came the harder work. Elias hitched up their old mule, Bess, to a stone boat and began the slow, arduous process of hauling flat, heavy stones from the riverbed a mile away. Each trip was a meditation in labor. The creak of the harness, the clatter of the stones as he loaded them, the straining grunt of the mule, and the long, silent walk back to the dugout. He made 4 trips a day. Boro trotted alongside him, his tail a low banner, his presence a steady comfort. He laid the first course of stones himself, setting them into a thick bed of clay he'd mixed with water from the creek. His father's journal was specific: a 2-foot-thick floor of solid stone, sealed with clay, followed by walls 3 feet thick. It was a monstrous amount of rock. He learned the weight and balance of each one, his hands growing calloused, then cracking, then healing into thick pads of hardened skin. He worked from dawn until the last light failed, his body screaming with exhaustion as he fell into his cot in the old cabin. But his mind was clear. Each stone was a word in an argument he refused to have out loud. One afternoon, as he was wrestling a particularly large capstone into place, a shadow fell over him. He looked up to see Lena, Silas Blackwood's daughter. She held a small wooden bucket. "I brought you some water," she said. Her voice was different from her father's, softer, without the hard edge of judgment. "I saw you from the ridge. You never stop." Elias straightened up, his back protesting with a sharp crack. He nodded his thanks, taking the bucket. The water was cool and clean, and he drank deeply. "Thank you," he said, his voice raspy. Lena watched him, her gaze taking in the deep pit, the meticulously placed stones, the sheer scale of the undertaking. Unlike the others who passed by, she didn't look at it as a fool's errand. She looked at it with genuine curiosity. "Papa says you're building a tomb." "It's a house," Elias corrected quietly. "With no windows? And no chimney?" she asked, not with doubt but with a desire to understand. Elias hesitated. He had not explained the theory to anyone, but something in her open expression made him want to. He pointed to the thick stone walls. "The stones and the earth around them will hold the summer heat. All this sun, all day long, for months. It soaks in, deep. The walls are thick enough to store it, like a battery, a heat battery." He picked up a handful of the dark, cool earth from the pit wall. "The ground 8 feet down never freezes. It stays a constant temperature. This house will draw on that, and on the heat it saves from the summer." Lena touched one of the large stones, her fingers tracing its rough surface. "And that will be enough? For when it's 40 below?" "My father's calculations say it will," Elias said. "It has to be sealed, no drafts. The entrance will be a long, angled tunnel with 2 doors, an airlock." She looked from the stones to his face, his skin tanned dark by the sun, his eyes focused and certain. She saw not madness, but a deep and unwavering conviction. "I hope it works," she said, and he could hear that she meant it. It was the first time anyone had said that. "It will," he said. The words felt solid in his mouth, as heavy and real as the stones under his hands. As autumn began to paint the valley in shades of gold and rust, the dugout took its final shape. Elias had finished the walls and now began the roof. He laid thick timber beams hewn from fallen logs, leaving only a small, square opening in the center. Over the beams, he layered sheets of oilcloth, then a thick coating of clay and tar for waterproofing. Finally, he began the painstaking task of covering the entire structure with the mountain of earth he had excavated. He packed it down, seeded it with native grasses, and shaped it until the structure all but disappeared, becoming a gentle, rounded hill in the middle of the field. Only the angled opening of the entrance tunnel, framed with heavy timbers, betrayed its existence. The community's talk had shifted from bemused pity to open mockery. Mr. Thorne, the man who owned the mercantile and held the mortgage on half the valley, stopped his buggy one day to watch. "Heard you're planning to live like a badger, Elias," Thorne called out, a smirk on his face. "I'll give you credit for one thing, it'll save on lumber. What do you plan to breathe? Stale air and dirt fumes?" Elias just kept working, patting soil into place. Even Mrs. Gable, a kind woman who had known his mother, stopped by, her face etched with worry. She left a loaf of fresh bread on a stump. "Elias, dear," she'd said, wringing her hands, "it's not too late to put in a stove. Silas would help you cut a hole for a pipe. No one would think less of you. We're all worried you won't see the spring." "I appreciate the bread, Mrs. Gable," he'd said. "We'll be fine." He and Boro moved in on the first day of October. The air inside was cool, not cold, and smelled of earth, clay, and stone. It was silent. The wind that had begun to keen over the valley was completely absent here. He had built a simple bed frame, a table, and a few shelves into the earthen walls. A single, well-sealed ventilation shaft, stuffed with sheep's wool as a filter and regulator, could be opened or closed by a simple wooden plug. For light, he had a small skylight of thick, cast glass set into the roof's opening, which he could cover with an insulated plug at night. His father's journal sat on the main shelf, the ultimate authority. The first frost came, silvering the landscape. Inside the dugout, Elias felt no change. The temperature held steady. He measured it with his father's old thermometer, 55 degrees. Outside, it was 28. He let Boro out to roam, and the dog would return with ice crystals on his whiskers, shaking himself vigorously before settling onto his blanket, content in the still, calm air. The days grew shorter. The snows began, light dustings at first, then a heavy blanket that buried the valley. The grass-covered roof of the dugout disappeared under the white, providing another layer of insulation. From a distance, there was nothing to see but a single timbered hole in a snowdrift. The smoke from the valley's cabins rose in thin gray columns against the pale sky. All except one. Silas would watch the still, white mound from his porch, shaking his head. "He's too stubborn to admit he's freezing," he told Lena. "He'll be out here begging for wood any day now, or we'll have to go dig him out in the spring." Lena said nothing. She just watched the place where she knew Elias was, and she hoped. Inside, life found its rhythm. The temperature had dropped, but only slightly. It now held at a steady 52 degrees. Elias wore a wool sweater and was perfectly comfortable. He had stockpiled dried meat, flour, beans, and preserved vegetables. He spent his days reading his father's books, mending his tools, and carving small figures from scraps of wood. Boro slept, ate, and would occasionally nudge the inner door, asking to be let out into the tunnel to peer through the outer door's small window at the swirling snow. The silence was absolute. It wasn't the dead silence of a tomb, but the living silence of the deep earth. He could feel the immense weight of the soil and snow above him, not as a burden, but as a blanket, a shield. He kept a log, just as his father had. December 10th. Outside temperature, 5 degrees. Wind from the north. Inside, 52 degrees. Air is fresh, no dampness. He would read the entries to Boro, who would listen, his head cocked, as if he understood the numbers and their profound significance. The real test began in the second week of January. The sky turned a strange, hazy gray, and the air grew so cold it hurt to breathe. The old-timers called it the long cold, a weather pattern that settled in every decade or so, a high-pressure system from the Arctic that clamped down on the land and refused to let go. The temperature plummeted. It dropped past 0, past 10 below, past 20. The smoke from the valley's chimneys thickened, billowing out as families fed their stoves constantly, the wood piles shrinking at an alarming rate. Mr. Thorne sold out of firewood in 2 days. Then he started selling the lumber stacked behind his mercantile at exorbitant prices. The wind rose, a relentless, scouring force that drove the snow into impenetrable drifts and pushed the cold through every crack and chink in the valley's log cabins. The temperature fell to 30 below, then 35. Silas Blackwood ran out of seasoned oak. He started burning greener wood, which filled his cabin with smoke and provided less heat. The windows were thick with frost on the inside. He and Lena huddled by the stove, wrapped in every blanket they owned, and still they shivered. The cold was a physical presence, an intruder that could not be banished. "He can't be alive," Silas said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Nothing can be alive in that hole now. Not without fire." Lena stared into the dying flames. "Maybe fire isn't the only answer," she said softly. On the 4th day of the long cold, the thermometer outside Thorne's mercantile, before it froze and burst, read 42 degrees below 0. The air was as sharp as broken glass. Trees groaned and cracked in the forest, their sap frozen solid. The world had gone silent, paralyzed by the cold. Inside his dugout, Elias recorded the temperature. January 14th. Outside, minus 42 degrees, estimated. Wind severe. Inside, 48 degrees. The internal temperature had finally dropped below 50, a testament to the brutal, draining power of the cold outside. But it was a dry, still 48 degrees. Wearing his thickest wool shirt, he was perfectly fine. Boro was asleep on his blanket, his flank rising and falling in a steady rhythm. The only sound was the faint, almost imperceptible hum of the earth. In the valley, desperation had set in. Mrs. Gable's stovepipe had clogged with creosote from the green wood she was burning, filling her small house with toxic smoke. She had been forced to put out the fire, and now her home was rapidly becoming as cold as the air outside. Mr. Thorne, his own grand house now chilly as his wood supply dwindled, refused to offer anyone shelter. "Every man for himself," he'd declared. It was Silas who finally broke. He looked at Lena, her face pale, her breath pluming in the air inside their own cabin. The fire was little more than a pile of glowing embers. "I'm going to check on the boy," he announced, his voice grim. It was not a mission of rescue, but of recovery. He was a decent man, and he couldn't stomach the thought of Elias frozen solid in his folly, alone. "It's the least I can do, for his father's sake." He bundled himself in layers of wool and oilskin until he could barely move. He took a snow shovel and a heavy lantern. Lena insisted on going with him. The walk was a brutal battle against the wind and the biting cold. The snow was drifted high, and each step was a monumental effort. It took them nearly an hour to cross the field that normally took 10 minutes. They reached the mound. It was just a featureless hump in the frozen landscape, the entrance tunnel almost completely buried. Only the very top of the heavy outer door was visible. There was no sign of life, no tracks, no smoke, nothing. "Elias!" Silas bellowed, his voice snatched away by the wind. "Elias!" There was no answer. With a heavy heart, he began to dig. The snow was packed hard as cement. Lena helped, her own shovel moving in a frantic rhythm. They cleared the outer door. It was crusted with ice. Silas put his shoulder to it, expecting it to be frozen shut. It swung inward with a surprising ease. They stepped into the tunnel, into the absolute blackness. It was a pocket of stillness, the raging wind instantly silenced. But the cold was still there, the biting, invasive cold of the outside world. This was the airlock. Silas fumbled with his lantern, his numb fingers struggling with the flint and steel. A spark caught, and a warm, yellow light filled the narrow space. Ahead of them was a second door, thick and heavy. This is it, Silas thought. A tomb. He felt a wave of guilt so profound it almost buckled his knees. He had mocked the boy, and the boy had died for his strange idea. He reached for the latch on the inner door, his hand trembling. He lifted the latch and pulled the door open. It was not a wave of frigid air that greeted them. It was a gentle, palpable wave of, not heat, but an absence of cold. It was the feeling of stepping into a calm room on a cool autumn day. The air smelled of clean earth and faintly of cooked beans. Silas lifted the lantern high. Elias was sitting at his table, a book open before him. Boro lifted his head from the floor, his tail giving a single, lazy thump against the clay. Elias looked up, his expression not of surprise, but of quiet expectation. He was wearing a simple wool shirt. He wasn't shivering. His face wasn't pale or frostbitten. He was simply there, alive and well. For a long moment, no one spoke. Silas and Lena stood in the doorway, their own breath clouding in the air of the tunnel behind them, staring into the impossible calm of the room. The lantern light gleamed on the smooth stone walls. A thermometer hanging from a nail on a timber beam clearly read just shy of 50 degrees. "How?" Silas finally whispered, the word a puff of white vapor. "The earth," Elias said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. He stood up. "You're cold. Come in. Close the doors." They stumbled inside, and Elias sealed the inner door, then the outer one. The change was miraculous. The oppressive, life-draining cold was gone, shut out completely. Lena began to unwind the scarf from her face, her eyes wide with disbelief. Silas just stood there, his lantern in his hand, looking around the small, warm, silent space. He looked at the thick walls, the earthen ceiling, at the boy who had built it. Our fire is out," Lena said, her teeth chattering from the residual chill. "Mrs. Gable's house is full of smoke. Everyone's wood is gone." Elias nodded slowly, absorbing the information. He looked at Silas, whose face was a mixture of awe, confusion, and dawning shame. "I told you, boy," Silas said, his voice thick with emotion. "I told you you'd freeze. I was a fool, an old, arrogant fool." "You didn't know," Elias said. There was no triumph in his voice, only a quiet statement of fact. "Bring them here." And so they did. Silas and Lena went back out into the 42 below nightmare, but this time they moved with a purpose born of hope. They brought Mrs. Gable first, half frozen and weeping with relief as she stepped into the warmth. Then they went to other cabins, gathering the coldest and most desperate. Soon, 12 people were huddled in the dugout. It was crowded, but it was warm. It was life. They sat on the floor, on the edge of the bed, leaning against the stone walls that radiated a steady, neutral coolness that felt like a roaring fire compared to the lethal air outside. Mr. Thorne was the last to arrive. He appeared at the door, his face blue with cold, his pride shattered. He had run out of wood for his own stove. "Elias," he stammered, Can I... Elias just stepped aside and let him in. For 2 more days, as the long cold held the valley in its grip, The dugout was an ark. Elias shared his food. He gave his bed to Mrs. Gable. He sat by his table, Boro at his feet, and answered their questions. He explained his father's theories, not with arrogance, but with the simple clarity of someone stating a proven fact. He spoke of thermal mass, of insulation, of the Earth's stable heart. They listened. Their skepticism melted away, replaced by a profound and humbling respect. They were alive because of the very thing they had mocked. They were warm, without a single stick of wood, sheltered in the heart of the stubborn boy's impossible dream. On the third day, the wind finally broke, and the temperature began its slow climb back toward zero. The crisis was over, but the valley would never be the same. The spring that followed the long cold was a season of unprecedented construction. The story of Elias's folly, now retitled Elias's warmth, had become legend. The first person to come to him for help was Silas Blackwood. "Will you teach me?" he asked, standing not far from the dugout's entrance, his hat in his hands. The snow had melted, revealing the greening grass on the dugout's roof. It looked like a natural part of the landscape. "I will," Elias said. And so they began. Elias didn't just give instructions. He worked alongside Silas, showing him how to choose the right site, how to gauge the depth, how to select the stones from the river. Lena brought them lunch and water each day, her conversations with Elias growing longer, easier. She asked about his father's books, about the plants he knew, about the dog who was his constant shadow. Mr. Thorne, humbled and deeply grateful, offered Elias anything he needed from the mercantile, free of charge. Tools, blasting powder for the tougher ground, heavy canvas, glass for the skylights. "It's the least I can do," he said, avoiding Elias's eyes. "You saved my family." Elias took only what he needed for the new dugouts, asking for nothing for himself. By the time the first snows of the next winter fell, there were 3 new warm houses, as they came to be called, in the valley. Silas's was the first, a near-perfect copy of the original. 2 other families, the Gables and the Millers, had built their own with Elias's guidance and the help of their neighbors. The construction had brought the community together. The shared labor of digging and hauling stone, forging bonds stronger than any winter's cold. Years passed. The warm houses became the standard dwelling in the valley. Their grass-covered roofs dotted the landscape, cool in the summer and safe in the winter. The ravenous need for firewood diminished, and the forests on the surrounding hills began to grow back, thick and healthy. Elias's father's theories, once the ramblings of a bookish eccentric, were now foundational law. Elias and Lena married in a quiet ceremony by the creek. They moved not into a new house, but into the original dugout, which they expanded, adding another room with the same patient stone-laying labor. It was their sanctuary, the quiet heart of their life together. Elias never became a loud man, never a leader in the traditional sense. He remained quiet, observant, and kind. His authority came not from speeches, but from the simple, undeniable fact that his knowledge kept people alive. People from other valleys would make the long journey to learn from him, and he would teach them freely, sharing the meticulously drawn plans from his father's journals. Boro grew old. His muzzle turned white, his steps became slower, and his gray eyes grew cloudy. But he was never far from Elias's side. One autumn afternoon, as Elias and Lena sat outside the dugout watching the sun set, the old dog, who was lying with his head in Elias's lap, gave a soft sigh and was still. His great, patient heart had stopped. Elias held him for a long time, stroking his fur, the silence deeper and emptier than it had ever been in the dugout. They buried him on the grassy roof, under a small, flat stone. He was the first believer, the silent witness. Elias lived to be a very old man. His hair turned the color of snow, but his back remained strong, and his hands, though scarred and wrinkled, were steady. He and Lena raised 2 children in the warm, safe earth, teaching them to listen to the land, to respect the old knowledge, and to innovate with courage. He saw grandchildren born, their laughter filling the quiet rooms of the expanded dugout. He outlived Silas and Mr. Thorne and Mrs. Gable. He became the valley's elder, the living link to the time before the warm houses, a man whose stubbornness had become the bedrock of their community's survival. He never tired of telling the story, not of his own work, but of his father's vision. He passed away in his sleep one winter night, in the bed he had built decades before, in the house that had no fire. He was lying next to Lena, the air a steady, comfortable 50 degrees, while a blizzard raged unheard above. The silence he had so carefully built was the last thing he knew. They buried him on the hill overlooking the valley, next to the simple stone that marked his father's grave. The entire valley attended, their faces etched with a grief that was also a profound gratitude. They placed a new stone for him, carved by his own grandson. It didn't list dates or accomplishments in the traditional sense. The epitaph was simple, just 6 words that captured the entirety of his life and his gift to them all. He taught us to trust the earth. From that vantage point, you could see the legacy. Below, the valley was nestled under a blanket of pristine snow. There were no columns of smoke tainting the clean, cold air. There was only the gentle landscape of rolling white hills, small, rounded humps beneath which the life of the valley pulsed on, warm and safe. Each one was a testament to the quiet boy who listened to his father, who trusted the earth, and who met the deepest cold not with fire, but with patience, wisdom, and stone. His structures stood. They were his monument.